Good afternoon. Thank you very much, leadership team, for taking the time to watch this video. This video is an introduction to the data management discussion we'll be having on next leadership team meeting's agenda. Overall, what I'm hoping you take away from this is that our current data management cycle or our current data management processes are a set of default processes that I think ERS has essentially grown into and not necessarily strategically designed and implemented. So going forward and during our discussion during the leadership team meeting, I'm hoping to get to this idea of how can we be more strategic around how we deal with data. Thank you very much.
I was hoping you could take a minute to explain some of the challenges that you have recently or currently faced here at ERS around data and the acquisition of data.
A couple weeks ago, Stephen asked me to hunt down some data on special education expense, both by model of service and by disability type. And the challenge for me was that in some cases I wasn't even sure if we stored certain types of data around disability type, and for the question of cost by model of service, I know that's a really important part of our analyses, but it's not stored in a standard way, like a lot of our resource map metrics. So it took me a while to find it, and I had to actually ask for help from one of my peers, and it just wasn't kind of a clearly signposted or efficient process.
If you had to guess how much time you spent on this process, what do you think it involved?
I would say to get to a point where we had a usable report for across districts for model of service, and when it was clear that we didn't have the relevant data on disability type, took about 90 minutes.
And that was both of you?
Well, I was just me for most of it, but maybe 30 minutes of Tano's time.
Great. And so where did you guys end up finding the data?
Just in sort of a kind of random, not random, but a cross-project report that wasn't really clearly labeled as to what it was, and was sort of tucked away deep in a list of other reports. It wasn't clear. Like, you wouldn't know from looking at it that this was the report to have.
Could you please sort of expound upon some of the experiences you've had here at ERS in regards to data and the efficiency at which you were able to get that data?
Sure. I think there's sort of three instances that come to mind when I think of data procurement. And the first one I'll speak to is trying to get school-level data across our partner districts so that we could do a summative analysis of how much of the variation in funding we could explain across districts, or across the schools within a district, but then looked at across districts. And so this is something that we collect very easily for each of our districts, but we never look at together. So the first thing I wanted to do was find out, do we have that information for at least 15 districts? And what I found was it was really hard to determine that because I'd have to go into each project separately. But Ben had just started creating these reports that let me know which districts had this information, which didn't. However, there was still this issue of trying to pull this amount of data from 15 districts where a cross-project report didn't cut it. I could only pull 2 or 3 projects at a time without CAPS running into a couple of issues. So the ask was, I think, bigger than what the infrastructure was necessarily built for. So that took me a few hours to pull those reports together.
And if I could ask, when you did pull the reports, how good was the data?
It was unclear. Some things looked fine, but given that some districts were off, I didn't know if I could intrinsically trust the data.
And did all of the districts have the specific information you wanted?
I'd say a little under half of them had the information I needed. Piece number 2 was trying to dig into funding source. So as a subset of that analysis, we were trying to really understand what revenue sources were funding particular expenses in different districts. So what I found was sometimes we coded it, sometimes we partially coded it. And so in doing this analysis, I found out that I'd have to actually go through and code it myself if I wanted to do that analysis. And so I had some time that I needed to spend trying to, again, understand the state of the data. Once I've been able to pull all of it, just getting a sort of stacked data set that for the few districts that had it was challenging because our standard financial analysis pull didn't include that particular column.
Can you approximate how many hours you spent?
Just investigating and pulling that data, it's definitely like 2 to 3 days on my own time. just like trying to understand it because I thought I was doing something wrong at first. But you know, talking back to a few people, this was something that we haven't explored before, so it wasn't the wrong thing to do. The third one was for our particular analysis in Oakland, in the citywide project, we needed to actually break down the model of service spend a little more deeply to a level that we actually don't store in CAPS. So for those of you familiar, we needed to break down the base weight into instructional and non-instructional portions, which given my investigation, I couldn't find that information stored in CAPS for every district. So what I ended up having to do is actually find the CAPS uploads, or rather the latest enrollment adjustments files in Minerva for each of the comparison districts we wanted to use. And that didn't take as much time as because it was only 6 or 7 districts as it could have if I had wanted 15. But it was still a few hours worth of work to track that down, and there were data validity concerns. I had to follow up with with our ERS district teams to make sure that each file that I used for each district was the latest and correct one that they had worked on, a year or 2 or 3 years or 4 years prior, which at times was a challenge.
So you had some good stories. I was just hoping you could dive into to sort of detail your experiences, especially it being your first project on working with data and trying to find data within the ERS environment.
I started understanding what the project was going to be about and had to deal with a lot of us trying to get to school level numbers to tie these financial metrics with non-financial data. So like really school databases that got to the school level. And there was an established process for doing that really that we thought was going to be effective after Thudun created one iteration with Palm Beach. And then it was tasked to me to go and replicate that with other districts for our first session. And that process became more difficult than I had anticipated because of the processes that I had to go through to try and get the right data, get the data clean, and all of that different stuff. When I first started, CAPS was depicted as this large beast that we wanted to stay away from as much as possible, but the way around that was to go talk to other teams about their financial files and how they crafted them to do what they needed to do, but also understand how I needed to work with them to get what I needed. And that became a very difficult process. And sometimes with one district that I was working with, I was trying to get to FundSource, but turned out after a couple of hours of trying to figure out the different ways and columns I could try and get at that, even if I had to code it myself, we understood that that just wasn't in the file at all. And that could have been something that was entirely avoided very early on. In another instance, we were working with a district whose CAPS pull was actually not as credible as another file that they had used. And it took us some time to have these two different data sources and weigh them against one another, talk to the team, go through multiple iterations of like understanding how we got to this point to see what we needed and what was the best information to use.
So what I find interesting, you said you had to go back into each financial file on Minerva. So just from a standpoint of uniformity or standardization across project teams and across financial files, did you see any similarities, or was it just sort of each financial file was its own unique beast?
To new eyes, each financial file was as different as each person at ERS. Like, yeah.
So, and I don't want to just focus on the worst case scenario, but the typical project team's financial file that you had to go back into and sort of sort through, how much time do you think you spent doing that?
And just trying to understand the file before I could start my work.
Exactly.
I would say between understanding which file I needed in Minerva, talking to the team, or finding out who I needed to talk to on the team, talking to that person, and then orienting myself in the file, that process was between like 4 hours to a full day.
On each financial file. And I think it's interesting to point out too, for your project, there are specific ERS coded fields, but you also needed other data to provide context to those fields, correct? Good. And so from a perspective of a new hire, how was your experience doing this? Was it kind of frustrating?
You could use that word. I feel like it was just tough. I didn't know what was my fault. I didn't know what was just common practice that was making it difficult. I didn't know what was what the expectation was, what the bar was. So there was just a lot of doubt, which I felt like could have made things even worse because you don't necessarily know as a new hire what you can ask help on, what is like a dumb question, or what is like a systematic thing that could be ameliorated.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you very much for your time.